for those that are not aware of MMT as it's known, we're talking about basically printing money, adding zeros to accounts, whatever it might be. The theory being that it's not going to affect things such as inflation or lead to hyperinflation as long as it doesn't go too far while the unemployment rate's still too high or while there's still slack in the economy. The argument being you can just keep printing.
Look, that's pretty much right, Tom. It would say that governments can spend more money and you can finance that by printing. And at a time like this, when there are heaps of people unemployed, you can do that without causing particular ongoing damage to the economy or in many ways to the budget. I'm being a bit unfair to modern monetary theory. That's a very quick summary, if you like. I also think that as it's typically put, it's just a little too good to be true. One of the earliest lessons I learnt back in Federal Treasury was, if it seems to be too good to be true, then perhaps it is. What I would note is that right now, the thought that government spending is needed and does very little damage to the budget ongoing is entirely true. Or many economists would agree with what modern monetary theory would be saying in current circumstances.
As in, don't worry too much about the debt and deficits. I mean, what's always put forward to contend against this is, of course, hyperinflation that's been seen in various countries. You can look at Venezuela, you can look at the German Republic way back as well. But one of the more recent examples of flooding, if you like, a modern economy with a lot of money and not having inflation was the GFC in America when we're talking about quantitative easing. Is there a lesson out of that that's more applicable, I guess, than just the sort of hell of a leather, all-in approach of MMT?
And there is something around that. And in fact, that experience with global financial crisis and the aftermath around the world is an interesting one. You did see governments spend a lot for a while, but governments eventually ran out of steam. They were too worried about debts and deficits. They left it to central banks and printing money. The more pure modern monetary theory view would be that governments themselves could have kept going harder. And again, in those circumstances, in those nations at that time, it would make sense. I think that most economists, not everybody, but most economists would agree, regardless of the labels you use, in current circumstances where unemployment is high, but the Reserve Bank, the central bank, is already essentially out of ammo. It's doing as much as it can, or close to as much as it can. Then every extra dollar of government spending is making a big difference at the moment. And again, to be clear, every taxpayer dollar is precious. You don't waste it. But every taxpayer dollar spent back into the economy right now is probably performing as valuable a job in Australia as it's ever done.
And I guess when you talk about every taxpayer dollar being precious, you still want to have schemes that help out the economy. I guess that the broader question here, moving on slightly from MMT though, is to what extent should we care about how much the debt piles up, how serviceable it is, but also whether or not Australia's situation, is it a question of just needing to compare it to the rest of the world? Because seemingly there'll always be some appetite for government bonds, even as we increase our debt in a relative sense massively amidst this crisis. Where else would you want to buy a government bond if not Australia? There might be a few other countries, but not many ahead of us in the queue still, even with a big increase of debt.
Yeah, and most people are aware of the basics, that we've been very successful at beating back the virus. The spike in Melbourne's a worry, but it is only a worry. And of course, we've been very successful economically so far, which is equally to say things are terrible out there, but they would have been much worse. Except for what we're doing. It's a good backdrop. The hidden weapon we had coming into this crisis was we had a balanced federal budget and low debt, low public sector debt. Now, that marks us out as a pretty unusual rich nation. It gave us, not just economically, but politically, more wriggle room to do stuff than otherwise. Those massive stimulus programs that we rolled out, they rolled out essentially with bipartisan support. We didn't stuff around. The money got to people. It looks as though it got to people faster than the equivalent schemes in the global financial crisis. Sure, our debts will be higher at the end of this. We're stuck with that. It doesn't terribly worry me. Interest rates have never been lower, and they'll stay nailed to the floor for some years. The other thing that people don't realise is that the budget is not broken. I keep hearing over and over, we're going to have to raise this tax or cut that spending. We've done temporary spending. If we can get the economy back in good shape, then the budget will be back to balance faster than people realise.
Yeah, there are a lot of talks about no surplus in, for anyone that's born in school today, which seems like a tad hyperbolic, but take that as a comment from me. Just finally, I want you to imagine that you're being invited in, you've been sent the code to the Zoom call. The Prime Minister said Chris Richardson is on the line and he's got one big policy that he wants us to enact post-September. What would it be?
And it's the one that everybody's talking about, that permanent increase in the unemployment benefit. The coronavirus, it revealed weak points in every single nation around the world. The virus doesn't care, who you are, and whether it was sort of inequality and racial tensions in the US and a health system that was geared to employment there, or migrant workers living in crowded conditions in Singapore. In Australia, it was that we did not pay enough by way of an unemployment benefit. So we did the right thing straight away. But it needs to be an ongoing increase. Again, people haven't noticed, but unemployment has gone up the most where it was already highest in Australia. The pain of the coronavirus is stunningly geographically specific. And each extra dollar of unemployment benefit on a permanent basis, not only should we do it because it's money in the hands of the poorest people in Australia and their living standards have slipped relative to everybody else's living standards for a quarter of a century, but it will help the poorest communities as well.